Welcome to our project managers meeting. These words may sound familiar, key roofing details. We've talked a lot about roofing in the last few years, and I think that, there's a very simple reason why, and just to illustrate it, I'd like you to raise your hand if you're working on a project that has an existing roof that we're being asked to repair because it's leaking. Yeah. Right? Come on, Mark, you got to raise your hand. There you go. Right. Well, I think probably almost half of our projects that we're working on right now have existing roofs that have a problem with them. It's pretty hard to do the complicated parts of roofing, and the trade experience level around here just isn't that great. Roofers do literally wear out, their bodies wear out, so there's a lot of turnover, and it's something that we have to be very careful to make sure it gets done correctly on our jobs. We have a couple of other presentations that are much more comprehensive that try to go through all the things that we need to know. But this one is just about some of the key things that I've seen over the last couple of years are still hard to get done correctly in the field. And the great thing is that Pro Tradecraft, which is a construction trade-oriented website, has done some really nice animations that we can look at on our phone and send the link to our roofers, and they can watch on their phone, that help explain some of these key details and how to do them the way that we'd like them done. So here's the things I'm going to cover. Roofing, edges, wall and masonry intersections, which I can't tell you how excited I am about. There's a handout that you can look at later that shows a really, really nice drawing of that, and then curbs and parapets. So let's start with framing, right? The shape of the framing has to be correct, or we can make it impossible to do a good job for the roofer in the first place. So there's a couple of key things that I've noticed lately. For example, on this house, bunch of chimneys. This was all framed when we started working on it. Crickets are supposed to match the slope of the roof that they're attached to. So when we arrived on this job, we had a 1612 roof landing on a 5-12 cricket. And the cricket was really small, and you could just visualize the water come screaming down this 1612 very steep roof and splashing onto the chimney, which is an intersection that's already very hard to do correctly, and just soaking into the masonry and causing problems. So we had them redo the cricket at a steeper slope, so now the valleys are farther away, it has much more water shedding ability, and that's the general rule. The slope of the cricket should match the roof. It's code, it's a good idea. So have our framers do that. We can talk to them before they start, and then nobody has to rework anything. Every once in a while we get stuck in a situation like this where we have a chimney that's in a valley, so here's the valley. The original framers already knew that this was an issue, so they had built a little tiny cricket. It came to a sharp point at the bottom, which I wasn't in love with, and you can see the valley kind of had to change directions right at the chimney. Again, I think a lot of water was going to come pouring down this valley and just splash against the chimney, already a very hard area to work. So what we had them do was build a much bigger cricket. Right? We extended all the way up to the top side of the chimney. It seemed like a natural stopping point. And we did two things with that. We put at the bottom here, we put a 6-inch wide space so that debris can wash out of the valley, and all that water shooting down the valley goes past the chimney instead of hitting it. And then because of the size that we did, the angle of change in the valley is much smaller, and much less water is going to wash out onto the roof. So generally speaking, if you ever have a valley change direction, the higher up the roof you can do it, the less of a change in angle there's going to be, the better it'll work. All right, pretty clear? So as I was talking about, we left that 6-inch space open. This is what happens if you don't. We learned this the hard way. Here's an area, the area circled in red, a large sort of overframed cricket comes all to a tiny point, and I'm up there taking pictures of it because it's full of leaves. There's an inch of water backed up behind it, and it found a hole in a solder joint. So if we had just made the bottom of that wider, then we wouldn't have had the leaves build up. There'd never be an inch of water. It might have continued to work without issues. This is how we do it now. When we frame this, I think you did this one. Judd, this might have been one of your jobs. We asked the framers to, instead of coming to a point, to leave a 6-inch flat section. This is one of Joe's job. Similar example. He had the framers put a 6-inch space. Now the bottom of the valley isn't right at the corner. All the leaves wash out, no problem. Here's another example of where we have a chimney kind of in the wrong place. Sometimes you can angle the chimney, other times you can't. In this case, this part of the roof wasn't visible from anywhere. We probably could have overframed the roof and made the valley straight. Would have cost a little more in framing. Should have cost a little less in roofing, and it'd be a much easier to execute job correctly, so much less chance of a problem. Don't do this. All right, we were asked to fix this. What's the fix? I mean, well, it turns out actually, this is in the skylight shaft is tapered. So it would have been easy to just taper it like this, slide that skylight 18 inches up the roof out of the valley. You could also use a smaller skylight. But I think what we did was caulk the heck out of it because the clients didn't want to spend any money. That's how it goes. Anyway, we should never build something where the skylight is, I mean, even 12 inches is kind of too close to a valley with the amount of water that can go through a valley. Okay, any questions on the framing? All right, so again, we're going to want to have this stuff sorted out ahead of time so the framers don't have to redo stuff, right? We'll talk to them, we'll tell them all this stuff. Okay, edges and underlayment. These are the key points. We always put drip edge everywhere. We want to talk about where we're going to do ice dam membrane, and we want to make sure that the underlayment on the sidewalls gets done correctly. Now I'm really excited about this. Hopefully I can make it work without an issue. This is one of these videos that Pro Tradecraft does. So, we're first going to start off showing how this is normally done by the book. You put the metal drip edge on first, and then you put the ice guard on top, then you put the rake edge metal on top of that. That works okay, and we do that sometimes. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is what I prefer. We put the ice dam on top and fold it down onto the fascia board and stick it to the fascia board. That way, no ice damming can get up between the drip edge and the fascia board. Another important point, we want to extend 2 feet past the wall. On a lot of our houses, that means more than one roll of material. You can use a full 3-foot second roll, or sometimes you can use half a roll, just cut it with a circular saw or buy the 18-inch wide version. It is important to get the overlaps correct. 3 inches is what all the manufacturers say, so the roofer should be able to handle that. Then you put the drip edge metal on top. Now I love how he talks about this. If you start the drip edge at the back of the house and overlap it towards the front, then when you look down the edge, you won't see the little spaces where the overlaps are. It'll hide. So that's pretty clever. This is optional. You don't have to seal the top of the drip edge with flashing tape. I have talked to a couple of the manufacturers, and they say that this is perfectly fine. Any water that gets on the ice and water guard using our method will end up on the fascia board. It's not really ideal. If you put the tape on, it protects from that, but this is optional. Still works pretty good without it. Remember, we don't have water on the ice and water guard very often. Here's another optional thing, is to run a strip of ice dam membrane up the rake. This is something that now in colder climates, some of the roofing associations are saying to do on steep roofs over 812, but this is not something that we are going to normally do. And then on the rake metal, you always want to put the higher piece over the lower piece, even though you can see the gap, because you don't want to have water get shot into that by lapping it the wrong direction. Everything goes shingle style, upper on top of lower. So that's pretty cool, right? We can show that. You can watch this on your phone and show it to the roofer, and it takes like 2 minutes. There's no language barrier. Go ahead.
So the ice and water you're going up the rake, you fold it onto the rake board?
I actually prefer to see that. Yeah, although we don't usually run ice and water guard, but with felt, I would run the felt wild, fold it over, and trim it off, personally, if I could. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm sorry. The question was, do we fold the ice dam membrane over the rake side as well as the bottom? And I would say yes. Anytime you can fold over, it's a little bit safer than cutting it off flush. Okay. Yeah, as I said, no language barrier, so if you don't speak Hungarian like half of our roofers, you're good. I think a lot of us have picked up some of the other languages, but not that one. Okay. So again, we're going to do drip edge on all the edges, rakes, and eaves. This is code everywhere except Virginia, and it's a good idea everywhere, so we do it. It's not very expensive. You can buy this. It's a stock profile. You can get it in black, brown, or white, so it'll match whatever your house is. You can paint aluminum if you have to, but I haven't ever really heard of an aesthetic issue with this metal drip edge. Sometimes roofers are worried about that, but I don't think it's a real issue. If you don't do it, you get rotted fascia boards and rotted rake boards. Our clients still know our phone number 3 or 5 years later, and that's why it's important that we build stuff that doesn't rot. One other quick point on drip edge, and this came up on one of our bigger jobs recently. Every once in a while, the drip edge really should go into the gutters to protect from water coming off the edge. Maybe we can get Josh to run upstairs and ask him not to do that. So the drip edge should go down into the gutter. So any water coming off the roof has to go in the gutter and can't run behind the gutter. But not every time can we get that done. Sometimes there's various reasons. One of them is on our bigger houses, the gutters slope, and they can slope from being behind the drip edge to being out from behind the drip edge. So we just need to add another little piece of metal that's fastened to the drip edge to cover that gap. So here's an example of where we had that gap and it caused a lot of paint problems below from the water washing down on top of the dormer. So, just add a little piece there. It's very simple and quick, but we do have to tell the roofers that they need to do that after the gutter guys get done. Okay, here's why I think the folding the ice dam membrane onto the fascia makes more sense. This leaks. Water backed up behind the drip edge on this house and dripped out of the soffit. So you can see what kind of pressure that area is under. It's much better to have a full connection between the fascia board all the way up the roof deck, in my opinion. Again, here's an example. This is on one of Mark Coles' jobs. He got the roofers to do this just exactly right. Ran the ice dam down onto the fascia board and then covered it with the drip edge metal. Here's a house where we can't do that. There's no fascia board. We can't run the ice dam down onto the fascia. No problem. Put the drip edge on first, run the ice dam on top of the drip edge. It's almost as good, but there won't be any ice damming filling up the gutters here because there's no gutters, so it won't be a problem. Now this is an issue that I have still seen a couple of times. We have our roofers run the ice dam membrane past the edge, and then the cornice people come later to put up the freeze boards and fascia boards. Some of them don't understand that we want the stuff to go down onto their trim, and they cut off the ice dam material. So that's what happened on this project. The cornice people cut off all the ice dam material instead of letting it flap over and for us to stick on later. So we have to have a conversation with the cornice people before they get going so they know not to do that. Pretty simple. Okay. We definitely want to go up about 6 inches on a house. I think actually 4 inches is plenty to get the job done. We always want all the roofing materials to come up the sidewalls. It has to protect from windblown rain going up behind the step flashings. I think if you ask for 6 inches, you can see it after the step flashing's on. You can be sure it was done correctly. And as in this example, you can see the upper part of this cut. They got a little bit off when they were wielding their knife on this folded material. You ask for 6 inches, you'll get 4 inches almost every time, and 4 inches is good enough, but we just say 6. That way people can make a simple mistake and don't have to redo it. As Dante was asking, I do think it's better to fold it down if you can. Sometimes we have moldings on the rake edge, and it's not practical to fold it down. You just stick it to the top. Another quick point on which type of ice guard to use. There's high temperature material that's good for any metal roof, and it has a much longer exposure time. So the materials that have black facers or no facer are usually rated for 30 to 60 days. And the materials with white facers are usually rated for several months, which is much more appropriate for some of our bigger jobs, right? It can take us a long time to completely cover a whole roof. So think about your job. If you're going to have it all done within a month, you can use any kind of ice guard. But if you're using a metal roof or you're going to have a long exposure, you're going to want to use one of these high temperature type materials. All right, this happened in, I think, a couple of months. I mean, this stuff was shot. That's what happened to the ice guard just from walking on it. So you got to be careful with that. Here's what Danny did on one of his jobs. And this is a very complicated roof. You can just see it'll take even a good crew a long time to execute all this copper. So what they did is they ran the high temperature ice dam material directly on the deck, and then they covered it all with another layer of material just to protect it from the sun while we were working on it. So that's an option if you know it's going to be a really long time. Okay, as I said, we're going to cover where to put it. We want to put it on all the eaves and all the valleys. That's where we really need this protection. We want to make sure it goes 24 inches from the outside wall of the house up the roof, 24 horizontal inches. So most of our houses, if they have an overhang much over 8 inches, you're going to need more than one roll. roofers have to be told that. Sometimes they just put one roll on, they don't think about it. Another good place for it is on hips, especially if you have a slate or wood roof where there's a lot of gaps between the pieces, a lot of windblown rain can go through the hip. And a lot of our slate and metal roofs, we cover the whole thing, although that's really mostly appropriate only for a vented attic. So you got to be careful with that. And the last point on ice guard, put felt on top of it if you're covering a whole area and you're putting shingles on it, because it's impossible to get the shingles off later. They get completely glued to the stuff. So just put another layer of felt over top of it all, and then nothing will get stuck. Okay, any questions on underlayment and edges? Okay, wall and masonry connections. Mostly this is going great. When I go out on jobs, everything's in the right sequence. People are using the right flashings. It's going really well. But we still, every once in a while, have a roofer who doesn't understand that the house wrap has to be pulled out in front of all the roofing materials, right? And so in this example, this is an example of one where it leaked, and we went up there, and this is what we found. Water was getting to the Tyvek, running down the Tyvek, and going straight behind the step flashing. So that's the issue. If the step flashing's on the face of the Tyvek, water will just run down into the house. We have to pull the Tyvek out in front, so any water on the Tyvek comes out onto the roof. Same story here. So I thought we had that mostly licked, but we fooled some roofers recently. What happened was the framers nailed down the Tyvek right kind of at the roof edge, 2 or 3 inches above the roof edge. They put cap nails, so it would have been really hard for the roofers to get it off anyway. And then they covered it with cedar breather type rain screen material. And I don't think the roofers had ever seen that before. They didn't really understand it. So they put all their material on the face of that yellow rain screen material. So water that got past this siding was going to go straight down behind the ice jam membrane. So that wasn't good. So once we explained to them, no, that's, we really have to pull all that stuff out in front, they went and did it. So again, this is just a conversation we need to have. Another good conversation is to have with the framers. Ask them to leave the bottom 8 inches of the wall wrap unfastened so it's really easy for the roofers. That's a good idea. All right. Okay, so different materials are going to require a different type of connection, right? We always want to be able to re-roof the roof without tearing off all the siding. That's really nice. So we want to have some re-roofing room. And a lot of the materials have a fairly high clearance requirement. None that I know of can be applied closer than 2 inches to the roof, or none that we use. So we need to make sure we have a 2-inch space between the roofing and the siding material, whether it's stucco or fiber cement board or wood siding. So how do we do that? I think one of the best ways is to just bend a piece of metal like this and stick it in to cover up that gap. We can also use a piece of synthetic trim. You don't have to cover the 2-inch gap. If you have a relatively thin cladding material, you can just have the step flashing showing. But if you feel like you need to fill up that space, there's a couple of options. And again, we want to be able to re-roof these buildings. Whoever has to re-roof this is going to have a hard time. The cladding materials are so close to the roof, you're not going to be able to get flashings up behind them. It's going to be very hard to rework. This is a better way of doing it, where we have a 2-inch space and a 2-inch piece of metal. So we have 4 inches to work before we get into having to cut into this stucco or the siding. There's an example of that. And again, we do need 2 inches of clearance, and I just want to emphasize this with fiber cement. If you don't do that, you'll get freeze thaw issues. It'll actually damage the material. So we want to make sure we have that 2-inch clearance. Again, right out of the Hardy manual, or you can use a piece of synthetic trim, 1.5 inches or 2 inches tall. Just put it on there. Okay, one other important part of connecting to siding and wood is what we call the kick-out flashing. So it's a special example of what happens at the bottom of a row of step flashings when you have a roof, a wall, and the roof ends in the middle of the wall. So we're going to have water coming down the roof. It's going to get into the corner of the step flashings right up against the wall. And at the bottom, in this house, it was actually going behind the claddings and running into the wall. Really, we want it to come out from behind the claddings and go into the gutter, but we have to put a piece of material in there that will make that happen. So here's what happened. It ran down behind there and ended up dripping in through a window and showing itself. Here's another project where we didn't have the kick-out flashing and water got in behind everything, caused some damage. this is the kick-out flashing. Okay, this piece right here, it's a special three-dimensional piece of flashing that you tuck in place of the last step flashing, and any water that comes down there gets pushed out into the gutter. So these are easily available. You can buy them at Home Depot. There's mail order, roofing supply places have them. They're in code. They're a really good idea. We have had several issues where we had real damage from projects where roofers omitted these. So we need to make sure these are going in our projects. And it doesn't look that bad. I mean, they're kind of big. When you're holding them in your hands, you're thinking, wow, what's that going to look like? Yeah. These clients had very high aesthetic expectations, very high. Mark's hiding. But they were okay with that. In the context of a big house, it hides pretty good, unlike the 120 paint flaws in the wainscoting that they put tape on. That's another story. Okay. There is one place where you don't technically need a kick-out flashing. If you're running lap siding and you're clever and you're very good, you can pull the last piece of step flashing out in front of the piece of lap siding, which you can see in this picture. But there are downsides to that. We ended up putting kick-out flashings on this house because the dripping water running down the siding was objectionable to the clients. It's also pretty hard to supervise. You have two different trades. They both have to do it just right. And some siding companies, it doesn't align with their directions. So I would just put the kick-out flashing in, everything else being equal. All right. Okay, now here I'm really excited about this too. So masonry connections, super complex, right? The framers have to get their part right. The masons have to get their part right, and they don't necessarily have the whole picture. Then the roofers have to do a couple of steps, and the masons have to continue, and then the roofers have to come back and finish. And we have to arrange all that. We have to have everybody do all their parts correctly. So lately we've had some issues with this, where we're spending a fair amount of time on the site helping the roofers learn how to do it. So I'm super, super pleased to be able to show them this. Okay. So the first thing we do, we frame the building, and then the masons come up with steps for the roofers to flash on top of. So the steps have to be high enough for 4-inch step flashing to pass under. So what we say is to lay a 2x4 on the roof and put the inside corners just above that, so there's room for 4 inches to go under it. Now, after the masons do that, I think it's a good idea to put peel and stick through wall flashing over this whole intersection, all the way up onto the plywood behind the house wrap. And there's two reasons for that. One is it's redundancy if anything goes wrong with the metal. But the main thing is then you're dried in. And we've had houses where these intersections have been open for several months, and every time it rains, water pours in the house. Much better to get this all wrapped up right as the masons finish. Then you can go out there with a hose and nothing's going to go wrong. Okay, so now we're going to put on the metal steps. And personally, and most of the industry books say the best way to do this is to have a separate pan for each step. That way any metal movement, there's space between them for that to be all absorbed rather than trying to make one giant piece. And a couple of key points on this, we're going to want to fold down the face of the block and out the face of the block for the counter flashing to connect to. And then the bottom one, we want to have the bottom side of the pan go vertical, as it shows right here. And that's so any water that lands in that bottom pan comes out. It's kind of a kick-out flashing for the masonry assembly. Okay? You can do a vertical upturn on all the rest of the pans, but it's hard to integrate with the masonry. And I think it's better to turn them down, which is what we show in this. And another kind of cool thing that he illustrated for us here is to have the lower piece have a hook on it, and then the counter flashing can just hook into it. We'll get to that in a sec. So another important thing with these is any water, these pans will be soaking wet. And if there's any tiny hole in it, water will go through the hole. So any joints in these need to be soldered. So we have had some roofers try to fold it all together and caulk it. Caulking's not going to last as long as we need these to last, right? These are in the middle of a masonry assembly. They're going to be there for 50 or 100 years. So all the joints in these pans need to be soldered. Okay, so as I said, most of these we normally turn down. Usually we turn down further than it shows, and then that right there showed the hook. You can see these little squares in the corner are just for clarity. One other thing at this outside corner, water could go down through there pretty easily, so we're going to want to solder in a little L-shaped piece And then this just shows how it finishes out. You run the step flashing, and then we add a piece that's called a counter flashing that covers the top of the step flashings. And in this case, it's going to hook into the hook on the pans. You don't have to do it that way. You can pop rivet it or screw it instead of hooking it, but the hooking's pretty simple and easy, and it makes all the metal stay straight. So again, I'm so excited by this. This is something we can show to the roofers and the masons, and I think they'll all understand the whole idea. They can watch it on their phone. Now, in this, the way that this animation runs, the roofing's already on and the house wrap wasn't. We would have the house wrap on already because that's the framer's job and they'd already be done. And the roofing wouldn't go on until the masonry is completed because you don't want masons walking around on a finished roof. But other than that, this is just how we do it. So it'll show you in a second here how they, like we do, we put a layer of felt in front of the Tyvek and then put weeps in the middle of the masonry assembly, at least one on each step so that water can get out very easily. Pretty cool, right? Oh, here, you're going to be a drop of water going down the wall. There, and out through the weep hole. I just think that's so awesome, right? Isn't that cool? And then we'll be able to show that to the masons and the roofers, and with luck, we'll get it done. All right, it's complicated assembly, right? So I'm going to step through that one more time. Here we are, we've framed the roof. The masons have come in, they put the block in the right place. One thing I do want to mention is how high do you want those steps? So in the animation and in this picture, we've gone up 8 inches on each step. And to my eye, that's really big. It's a very big step. In fact, I think we ended up redoing this area because the clients thought the steps didn't look right. So traditional, we can ask the designers in the room, would be much smaller, right? It would be like 1 brick or maybe 2 bricks. So 2 2/3 inches, 5 1/3 inches, is that about right? Yeah. So I think if you're working with brick, you might want to do 1 or 2 bricks per step. Some of it depends on your slope too. On a steep slope, higher steps are much more appropriate. On a low slope, lower steps. If you're working with block and stone, you might want to do half a block vertical per step, so 4 inches per step. I think those look a lot less big than the 8-inch steps. The 8-inch steps really start to look pretty big. Okay? All right. So as I said, the next step after getting all that in is to cover it all with stuff. Now you're dried in. It can rain all at once. Your framing lumber is not getting wet. Your basement slab isn't absorbing water. We're just much better off getting this dried in right away. Put the metal pans on top. Run the masonry up from there. Put on the roof and the counter flashing, and you're done. The hard part, obviously, is the first couple of steps. All right, any questions on all that? Okay, very excited about that. One thing I do want to mention, when we do chimneys, I do think it's questionable to use asphalt-based sticky stuff in a chimney because asphalt-based sticky stuff will melt if it gets hot. It can even catch on fire if it gets hot. And chimneys get really hot. If you're within 8 inches of the flue liner, very questionable to use an asphalt material in that. So for most of our chimneys, we're probably just going to use only metal. You can still run the peel and stick up the outside and seal it to that so that you're kind of dried in, except for what leaks through the masonry. But I'm not sure you want to keep going all the way into the middle of it. Here's another quick picture of how it's done. Counter flashing, step flashing, counter flashing. One other thing I'll mention, one of our roofers prefers to do, instead of individual pans, they like to sort of solder together one giant pan. And I think on a small-ish structure like a chimney, where the total length of the metal is 2, 3, 4 feet, I think that's going to work out just fine. We've never had a problem with this, and we probably have 20 of these that were done this way. So I think this is an acceptable way to do it. If your mason prefers to do it this way, your roofer prefers to do it this way. And another quick point on chimneys, that where you turn the corner can be really complicated. And I think that we're going to have to get up there on the roof a lot of times with the masons and help them sort out how to make all of the steps a minimum of 4 inches high and all equal, right? So you might have to actually make the steps on the side all steeper and taller than they otherwise would be in order to have the step going around the corner work out correctly. it's a little bit of a head scratcher at the corners. And the last thing, we want to seal all our chimneys because otherwise water going through the masonry is going to throw a lot of efflorescence out onto the roof, which clients don't like. So most of our masons are doing this now. They're really good breathable sealers, and we want to cover all of our chimneys with a breathable sealer. Okay. Yes. It's being pointed out that we should also do a really good cap on our chimney. As you guys probably know, I'm a big fan of metal caps. I think they're cheaper than the masonry ones. I think they last longer than the masonry ones. Certainly for any client who's intending to own a house for more than 15 years, it's going to be cheaper because the metal cap will still be there and the mortar cap will require a $2,000 repair or more depending on how high some of these chimneys get. So I would always do a metal cap if a client will accept the aesthetics of that. Okay. So here I have handouts of all of these. You can stick these in your project book. You can show them to your tradespeople. And I'm just so pleased to have finally a good drawing to show that whole sequence. Okay, let me cover this last thing pretty quickly. It's actually a pretty straightforward issue. When we use metal pieces to cover a surface, almost all of them are going to have corners or they're going to be longer than 10 feet, so we're going to have joints. When you have joints in metal, the metal will move. It moves too much to seal the metal together permanently. Like no matter what sealant you use, it's going to break before long. So we've seen a lot of problems with that. We get called out on a roof, the edge metal's leaking, the joint in the edge metal's leaking, and tons of damage happens. I mean, you can just see a lot of these roofs, they have more than one color of caulking on them because they've been leaking so badly, they've been repaired more than once, repaired with caulking. So instead of just having the metal on and then sticking the roof to that, what we're going to do, we're going to take our substrate, run the roofing over the corner before we put any metal on so that the roofing material turns down vertically and all the water is going to end up following that roofing down. We nail the edge metal on top of that and then use seam tape to make the edge metal watertight to the roof. So this is a much better detail, and you can see it's right out of the Firestone EPDM book. They show it either way, but this way doesn't leak and the other way does, so we should have the roofers do it this way. Quick conversation with them ahead of time, and they'll do this for us all the time. This is how it looks, another one of Mark Coles' jobs. So it's the same situation with parapets, right? They're covered with multiple pieces of metal. You can caulk them when you first put them in, and maybe they won't leak at first, but then they will leak later. So we want to make sure we have full protection under it. Again, we're going to run the roofing material or ice dam material all the way up, over, and down the parapet so there's nowhere for water to leak in. Then we cover it with whether we use the fancy, super fancy Firestone multiple piece cap or just a simple cap like we normally do. And a skylight's another situation like that. Not only do we have the issue of the joints between things, but we drill big holes in them that sucks the waterproofing down to a low point. So we want to go all the way up, over, and down on the skylight curb. It leaves you with an aesthetic issue to deal with on the inside, but it's much better than a leak. So no matter how well you seal it, it's going to leak. Here's a skylight that had been leaking for a while. We were asked to repair it. We built a little dam out of 2x4s and duct taped it to the roof, which held 2 inches of water for a couple of hours. No leaks, so it was all fine. Then we popped the skylight off, and this is what we see. The roofing material comes up, it doesn't even touch the skylight, so a good hard splashing wind-driven rain will get right up in there behind the roofing material. So instead, you want to go up all the way over the curb. Here's another example, a commercial skylight we put in. This is the aluminum flashing that came with it. I don't think this is an issue of how the work was done. I just think any two pieces of aluminum can never be sealed together. So instead of trying to count on this aluminum metal to deal with any condensation that happens in there, we should have wrapped the material over the curb, just like they show in the books. Pretty straightforward. Wrap up and over, you will have condensation. And one other quick point to throw in, let's make our curbs slope so that the water runs off the glass skylights instead of puddling in the corners. Okay, any questions on any of that? All right, I want to really give a great shout out to Daniel Morrison, who did all those animations and the drawings. I mean, I'm just so excited to have these, and hopefully we'll get some more for some of these other difficult areas. All right. Okay, great. Everyone, let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back and start the second half of our meeting. Thank you.